spring is finally upon us. I am out in my shop in just a hoodie, no jacket or hat or anything. This is exciting. So I want to build an end table, and I saw a bunch of these examples where some of them were made up of 4x4s and some of them were just made out of stumps that were carved, like with chainsaws probably. So I think I want to try to attempt to make something that the base looks similar to this, but I thought it would be cool if the top was removable and it was a tray that you can lift out and then use it to like serve drinks and stuff like that, but then store it back into the table and the handles will remain flush so you can use it as a stool or a side table and the whole surface would be flat. So let's get into it. I debated whether to use a stump and to try carving it or to use 4x4s. Obviously, I'm going with the 4x4s here. And I'll just need 3 of them to make up this table. First step is to rough cut all the pieces. I'm going to need 12 of the longer pieces that are going to make up the perimeter, and these are around 20 inches long. And one more just in case. So that takes care of the 12 perimeter pieces. There's going to be 4 pieces that are going to be in the center, but they're not as long. So it's going to be hollow down the center of this whole table just to relieve some weight so it's not a giant chunk of heavy wood. So those 4 pieces are going to be made up from this chunk here, but I won't cut these to their final length just yet because I still need to prepare all these pieces and take off all of these rounded edges that are on all of the edges of the 4x4. The ideal tool to get this square would be to use a jointer first and then to use one jointed edge as a reference to get everything else squared up. I think this only worked because the pieces were short, so they were pretty straight. There's no way this would have worked if I tried to do this on the full 8-foot length boards. I need to chop up this one for the center pieces. I cut these to about 3 inches long so that there will be more than enough material when I clean it up later. All right, now I'm going to lay everything out so that I can try to figure out the best way to glue everything up. So I have this all loosely clamped here, and I'm just trying to figure out what my next step is for the glue up process. Do I just go for it and try to do this all at once, or do I do this in stages? Does it need any reinforcement? So I don't think that it needs any reinforcement because the glue is going to be plenty strong to keep this whole thing together, but I do think it's going to help with alignment to add something in there. So I think I'm going to go with some loose tenons just for the sake of making my life easier during the glue up. I made sure to mark all the pieces so that I know how to reassemble them when it comes time for the glue up. And I just took a ruler and made a line going across both the pieces. And that's going to be my line for where I'm going to make the mortises for the loose tenons. I made this mortising jig in a previous video if you're interested in checking that out. To use it, there's a reference line on the bottom of the platform, and you just line that up with the lines that I marked out in the previous step. And then you just clamp it onto the workpiece and plunge it until you get to the desired depth. This step is totally not necessary. The glue will 100% be strong enough to hold all these pieces together. It's really just there to help make the glue up go easier and to eliminate too much cleanup after the glue up due to uneven surfaces. You can also use dowels or biscuits for alignment if you don't have a jig like this, or you could just skip it altogether. But something you can't skip on, good workwear. Throughout this video, you're going to see me wearing a bunch of different sweatshirts and other attire from Area at Work. These clothes aren't just comfortable and cool, they're also keeping me safe. The sweatshirts that I'm wearing are flame resistant, which you'll see later on in the video is pretty important. And here's a shot that I don't normally put in my videos, but I feel like it captures an aspect of my work that sometimes gets ignored. I'm on my feet all day standing on this concrete slab in my garage, and I'm not getting any younger. So wearing the right work boots to make sure that my feet are comfortable, which then saves my knees and my back, is so important. These boots are comfortable to stand in all day, and there's a safety toe to keep my feet safe. and they look cool too. So it's a win-win for me. If you're looking for hard-wearing, durable workwear that looks and feels great, check out the link below where you can find a list of my favorite items from Aerie at Work, and you can save 10% on your first order. Woo. That's the last one. So that took about an hour to do all these mortises. Depending on how this glue up goes, I'd say that's an hour well spent. Let's see how this all fits together. Oh yeah. All right, so I think it's going to be best to do this like in stages, like each side, and then get it all clamped together. Yeah, let's do that. If I didn't use these loose tenons, I probably would have done this glue up in a few stages. Like first glue together each of the separate sides, then because the pieces would be misaligned, I would then clean those glue ups up, and then finally assemble the whole thing afterwards. So spending an hour to make those mortises for the loose tenons ended up saving me time because I could do this whole glue up in one fell swoop instead of in stages. Whew. Okay. Whew. Pretty stress-free. Okay. Gonna get one across the middle there, but before I do that, I'm gonna address the top area. I did not do a practice run on these. Probably should have. The center pieces just slid right into the middle, and I set them below the height of the perimeter pieces for two reasons. Number one, it's going to be easier to level off the top surface, which you'll see in a bit. And number two, I'm going to route out a large cavity for the tray anyway, so it's less material that I have to remove in the end. Because of the loose tenons, the pieces were all level with each other, so I only had to clean up the glue squeeze out after it dried. And then I had to clean up the top and bottom by using a Tracksaw. But the blade isn't big enough to cut all the way through, so I just started the cut by going all the way around all four sides. Then using a handsaw, I could cut away the rest. This is why I set those middle pieces below the surface during the glue up. It would have been way more difficult to flatten this area if I also had to cut through that whole middle section. All right, so I just hit that with the belt sander for a bit, and it's a lot better, not perfect, but I am going to work with it, and it's totally fine because the whole shape of this table is going to be a little bit organic looking, and it's not supposed to look perfect. So I'm going to spend a while now probably deciding where to cut off all the edges to create the geometric shape. I'm gonna try my hardest not to put any thought into this and to just try to make it as natural and organic as I possibly can. So this might take a while, but hopefully not. Of course, it took me longer than expected to try and not to put any thought into making those marks. All right, I marked out the bottom ones, and my original plan was to use a handsaw to cut these. But now I'm thinking that I can get this done with a reciprocating saw. I'm gonna start with the bottom ones first, just in case this doesn't go well. I don't like that at all. I'm gonna go back to hand tools. I also considered using a circular saw set to those random angles, but the handsaw was where it was at for me. This saw that I'm using is called a Ryoba Saw, and it has two edges on it. One edge is for cross-cutting, and one edge is for ripping. I was using the cross-cutting edge when I was leveling the top and bottom, but for these cuts, I used the ripping edge. The ripping edge has less teeth, so it actually cuts pretty quickly, and I love using these saws. I'll make sure to link to it and other awesome tools from woodcraft down below. Whew. Looks pretty cool. Now the shape is cut out, and I can work on figuring out the built-in tray situation. So I marked roughly 1/2 inch around the perimeter and marked it off with tape, thinking that this would be the best way to transfer the shape onto a piece of plywood. I have no idea if this is a good idea or not. Okay. Seems like it was a decent idea. All right, not bad. I just marked out the inner edge with a pencil, so I didn't need the tape anymore and could cut out the shape on the bandsaw and then clean up all of those cuts on the belt sander. Next, I'll need to make the recess in the top to fit this tray, so I used a marking knife around the perimeter of the tray to establish that cut line. Off camera, I built this really simple jig. So this is going to help me ride my router along the top here to hog out the center. It's essentially like a flattening jig. I just slapped it together in a couple of minutes. So it's a little bit rough, but I think it's gonna do the job. I used a scrap from the tray plus another scrap to account for the finish that I'm going to use to set the depth on the router. Now let's see how this whole setup works. It's really hard to see my line, so I'm really scared that I'm going to go past it. So I'm going to mark off the edges with tape so that I don't go over my lines and I can easily see them. Hopefully this helps. The tape totally helped. Really good idea. I did this all in multiple passes so that I wasn't taking off too much material at once. And the first step, I would just follow the cut line and go around the perimeter so that I would try my best not to go over that tape line. Then I could just run the router back and forth to hog out the material that was left over in the middle. So each pass is taking me about 10 minutes to do, but I think it's gonna go okay. This jig is working all right. But kids are calling and it's dinner time, so I'm gonna have to continue this another day. All right, next day, it's a little bit chilly out again. Got my jacket back on. And before I get to routing out this whole top thing, I want to do some experiments with finishing because I'm still just not sure how I want to finish everything. Pine is kind of tricky to finish, so just not sure what I want to do yet. I know that for the top tray, I want to do an epoxy pour. So I'm going to test out some different colored epoxies on here first, and then based off of the colors that I like for this, then I'm going to figure out what I'm going to do with the base. While that dries, I can finish routing out the top. So I kind of felt like I was a human Etch-a-Sketch when I was following the perimeter, and following that perimeter is really what was the hardest part about this, and that's what took the longest time. So when I was doing this, I thought that maybe it would have been easier for me to make a template and to use a flush trim bit to follow along that, but whatever, this worked. I just needed to clean up the edges with a chisel, first by roughly getting close to the line, and then refining it to the line using the tape and the score line that I made earlier as a reference. Not too bad. My test samples for the epoxy have cured, and just like I thought, I'm gonna go with the turquoise color. Not only because I think it looks cool, but because my kids voted for this one. I think the other colors are really nice also, but I think I could create a really cool contrast with this one. Since I'm going with a glossy and smooth finish for the tray, I think it would be really cool if the base was a dark textured kind of thing. So if you've ever tried to stain pine, you know how difficult it is. So there are two different parts on the grain. There's the early wood and the late wood, and the difference there is that one is softer and one is hard. In the soft areas, the stain is going to soak right into there, but on the hard parts, it's going to just rub right off no matter how hard you try. So I think the solution here is to take advantage of the grain on the pine and to texture it with some fire. All right, so this was my first attempt at ever doing this technique. Some people call it shisugiban, but I think that can only be called that if you're using cedar. So I'm just going to call this torched wood. There are a few different effects that you can achieve from this process. You can go really light and only burn the softer grain, or what's known as the early wood. And you can see here that even though the torch is passing through the whole piece, only the softer grain is getting color, just like what would happen with a stain. But that's not what I'm after. I want that harder grain to get burnt as well. So I did another pass. This time I just went slower. I would wait until I saw a flame forming on the wood itself and then push the flame along with the torch. There were some areas, like around the knots, that needed some special attention, and I would just hover over those spots until I saw that it was all burnt. So I was using propane there, but MAP gas burns hotter, so I tested that out as well, and it was way quicker. You can see how much bigger the flame is here. So the MAP torch was quicker, but the propane worked just as well. And there goes all my hard chiseling work. You can seal the burnt wood in just like this, or you can create a really unique texture by brushing away all the charred wood that's in the softer grain. I just used a brass brush and it was fine. I actually purchased a nylon flap disc for my drill because I thought that I was going to need that, but I didn't need to use it and this worked totally fine. The purpose of going through the trouble with the whole fire was to reveal the grain. So I'm not sure that the texture is coming off on camera, but if you run your finger across here, there's dips and valleys where the softer wood was burnt away and it leaves the higher, harder grain here. So if you just put finish on it at this point, it's totally acceptable and totally doable. It looks really nice, but it's a little bit too brown for what I want to do. I want to make this whole thing look like a piece of black charcoal. So I wiped the whole thing down with mineral spirits to clean up any of the excess char and soot, let that dry, then coated the whole thing with black stain. Because the harder grain remained burnt and black after brushing off all the char, there's no more issue of worrying about if the stain is going to soak into that hard-grained areas. And the stain soaks into the softer sections with ease, leaving a really cool texture that stain alone would never provide. All right, cool, time for the trays. I placed tape on the underside of the plywood to catch the drips. And I still wasn't sure what color I was going to use, so I decided to pour a second color. I made sure everything was level and got to mixing the epoxy and poured it on. For the piece that I already cut to shape, I just made sure that the epoxy was dripping down on all the sides, and on the other one, I just made sure that the epoxy covered the lines that I drew on it. I popped all of the bubbles with a little torch, which is always the most satisfying step of working with epoxy. Oh hey, that's me. So it was 72 degrees outside that day, which is a perfect temperature for the epoxy to cure outside. But I wanted to protect it from any leaves or bugs from falling in, so I used that flattening jig from earlier to make a tent out of my kids' towels. While the epoxy cured, I could work on the handles. I cut 4 pieces of brass bar sock to roughly the same size, then taped them together and sanded the ends to get them all to be exactly the same size. I repeated the process on 4 more pieces to make the posts of the handle and spent a good amount of time sanding and cleaning up all the pieces. I'm not going for a super shiny look here, just clean and polished. And then I got to soldering. This is my first time ever soldering brass like this, so any and all suggestions are welcome. I extended my workbench by clamping some aluminum T-track to it. This way I don't have to worry about burning my bench or any of my other clamps. And then I applied some Flux where I marked where I wanted the posts to go. And then I placed those posts in an MDF holder jig sort of thing that I made by drilling out the holes at the spaces that I wanted and just balanced it all on top of that whole setup, making sure it was all aligned like I wanted it to be. Then I hit the brass with the MAP gas from underneath, waited for the flux to start bubbling up, and just touched it with the solder, and it flowed around the whole post. I was so shocked at how easy this was. For real, I was expecting this to be way harder than it actually was. The hard part, I think, was cleaning up the joint, and I tried a few things. Some polishing wheel attachments on the Dremel, which seemed to work okay. Some files that took off a ton of material, but then required a lot of extra sanding, and just sanding in general. I finished it off with some steel wool, and it looked okay. Not great, but I think it's pretty cool for my first attempt. The epoxy is dry on the trays. Time to clean them up. The one that's already cut to shape had tape under it to catch the drips. This tape can easily be removed by adding a bit of heat from a heat gun, and that little mess can easily be sanded away. The square one gets cut to shape now. I placed tape on all of the pencil lines that I can see through the epoxy, just to make it easier to line up the Tracksaw on those cuts, and then I cut away. Well, I made each one of these cuts in 2 passes. This saw has a scoring mode, which is specifically for scoring plywood veneer so that it doesn't chip out and all that when you cut it. So I was worried that the epoxy would chip. So I used that scoring cut first and then went back and went full depth to cut it out to its final shape. And I think those cut edges look pretty killer. I feel like I never use my CNC on my videos, but this is just such a perfect application for CNC. You can also do this with a regular router and some guidelines like I'll do for a bit for the finger relief cut that I'm going to make. I used the template that I made earlier to hold the pegs during the soldering to mark out the hole locations and then drill them out using a bit that was slightly larger than the pegs to allow for some slop in my soldering. Next, I used some scraps with double-sided tape as guidelines for making a little recess so that you can lift up the handles. I'm using a core box bit here. And because my solder joints were protruding a bit, I just countersunk all the holes so that everything will be really flush. All right, so the handles fit nicely into the top of the tray now. And now I need to do a cutout in the actual base so that these pieces fall through. I totally should have done this before finishing, but it's still not too late. I taped off the general area, then put painter's tape tabs on the sides of the tray. This way I can put the handles in the tray upside down, then lift up the tray with the tabs so that the handles stay in the correct location, and I can mark those out with a pencil. The depth of those holes needs to be basically the whole depth of this bit, so I'll just eyeball that depth and drill out the holes. The brass bar stock was 1 inch wide, so I used an 1.25" Forstner bit here to allow for some slop as well. I wasn't aiming for a pressure perfect fit at all. These holes just need to get connected and squared off to make this giant mortise, and this wasn't easy to get perfect at all because I was going into end grain pine that was already burnt, but I tried my best to make it as even looking as I possibly could. The bottom of the mortise would be nearly impossible to get super clean, so I cheated. Instead of attempting to clean it out, I added a layer of epoxy to build it up and smooth it out. Since it's end grain, I had to do a seal coat first to make sure I soaked up all of the open end grain pores. Then I could pour in another layer of the epoxy. Not only does this make cleaning up the bottom easier now while I'm making it, it will make it easier to clean this shiny, slick surface if anything should ever fall into these holes. So I've been debating the whole time which one to use for the tray. I really thought that I was gonna go with the turquoise one because I thought it was a cool contrast. I thought it looked like fire and water, which I think is cool. But I think that this one is going to go better in my house. So I'm just going to now stain all those exposed plywood areas black so that it blends in better with the base. Now that the tray is dry, I can attach the bottom part of the handles. This was a bit trickier because I had to do this while the handle is attached to the tray. So I just made a spacer block out of some plywood to clamp the tray at the correct height while being able to rest the brass on the aluminum extension bars. This seemed a bit janky to me, but it worked okay. I was so scared I was going to burn the tray that was above, so I just lowered the flame and took my time just being careful not to burn it. And it's done. First of all, I'm really proud of myself regarding these handles. I stepped out of my comfort zone and learned a new skill, and I can't wait to learn more about this whole process so I can apply it to more of my builds. So excited about this. Just in case anyone's wondering what the turquoise would have looked like, here it is. I didn't have enough brass to make a second set of handles, but I could eventually make them or swap it out if I ever want to. I still really like the contrast of the turquoise, but the gray just speaks to me. And I'm curious which one you guys prefer. Also, the tray. Does it need to be built in? No. Was it a lot of extra work? Yes, but I think it just looks cooler this way, and I'm really happy that I put in that extra work. I also think that the handles look so cool that they're flush, but they totally don't need to be flush at all. What's cool though is that this tray is now double-sided. I don't know what sort of practical application this is for, but my kids realized that and they thought it was cool, so I think it's cool too. While using the tray for drinks or other things, the table can be used as another surface for serving things, or you can put a pillow on it and it's a stool. Just one last shot here of the texture close-up. I think going through the process of burning it and then staining it was all worth it to do on this pine. I just love how this looks. It's like a geometric lump of coal, and then there's this bright shiny top. I'm just loving the contrast. I hope you guys had as much fun watching this as I did making it. Thanks to this week's sponsors, Woodcraft and Ariat. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. This is gonna take a while. Why do I do this to myself? I could do this all day. This is so much fun. I need to find more stuff to burn. It's hot. This is a scary cut to make. It helps if you plug it in.